All right, welcome to this lesson on dependent origination, some of the most profound wisdom. And that talks about how the mind creates our subjective realities. And I can't do the subject full justice just in these short lessons, but I'll try to give kind of practical overview of how we can apply it in life and meditation. It's not just a theory, but it's something we can observe for ourselves. So, dependent origination was discovered over 2,500 years ago by Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, an incredibly talented meditator, obviously. I mean, he's the Buddha, which means the one who woke up. And this theory of dependent origination comes from his keen attention of observing his own mind and how it works in real time on a kind of micro scale and also on the macro scale. And what he realized is that there's these series of causal links, or nidana in Pali, and they are basically components of our experience that lead to others. It's almost like a house of cards that's stacking up. So the foundational layers then allow more cards to stack up, and before you know it, you've got a huge card house. But it all started with just a couple of cards in the bottom foundation. Now, I'll talk about what those cards are in a moment. But this theory was so foundational that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, declared, quote, "One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma, his teachings, the natural laws." So that was one of the statements he made. And there are many versions of dependent origination as laid out in the ancient texts. Sometimes there are 12 links or 23 links or fewer links, but it's more about noticing how our experience starts with a tiny moment of experience, and then that builds into larger and larger situations. So let's look at an example. In cognitive science, when the eyeball detects a light photons from an object, these excite rods and cones in the retina. Then this information enters the brain through the optic nerve. Then with that sensory data, there can be a kind of positive or negative valence, like a feeling tone, a pleasant or unpleasant feeling associated with what we're seeing. Like if we're looking at a bear, there's probably a negative feeling that's saying, get out of there. And if we're looking at something we desire, like an apple on a tree, then there's this feeling of wanting to go towards it. So all of this happens literally in the blink of an eye. And if we look at the chain of events there, it was just photons that entered the eye. But then there was a feeling tone, and coupled with that, there was a perception or a naming of it, bear or apple, that was registered very fast in the brain. And then there can be thoughts about it, like, what should I do about this? Or that reminds me of the time when I saw this other apple, and is it ripe? Or how should I get it? So then just a couple of thoughts before we know it, we're in a thought story, a full-on kind of internal monologue about what we just saw there and what we should do about it. So we see how a simple sight, a few photons hitting our eyes, set off this whole chain reaction. Well, what we just went through is dependent origination, seeing how when any of our senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, our skin, make contact with external sensory data, information, then that enters in the mind, and the mind starts to process it and starts to fabricate our experience. And this can also happen from other thoughts. So there's all these feedback loops within dependent origination. One of them is just that if you're sitting there idly doing nothing, your memories might come back and then trigger other memories and other thoughts about those memories. And then eventually you might start thinking about what you have to go do next or planning something in the future. This kind of mental time travel where we go into the future and past is potentially unique to humans, although there's a species of bird called the scrub jay that store food in a way that suggests future planning. But nobody's asked them, we can't kind of probe their inner states. But regardless, our ability to think very far out in the future and have, retirement plans is certainly unique to us. And that's a beautiful thing. It allows us to, have civilization in the way that we do, but it also creates some problems. For one, our thoughts tend to be negative. We have a negativity bias. So we're often worrying and ruminating about the past and things we regret. So this uses up a ton of our energy and it kind of brings us down. And in fact, the network in the brain called the default mode network that's linked to this type of mind wandering and rumination, it's been linked to various mental disorders. And one of the things that you're training in meditation is to step out of the default mode network or activate other networks or just have more conscious control over when you're going to be using your thoughts so that the automatic process doesn't play out as much and bring you into a kind of contracted, me, like worried state of mind. And research has shown that with practice, meditation does indeed loosen these connections in the default mode network and allow you to create new neural pathways that are more adaptive and take you out of that kind of dramatization of whatever you're seeing and hearing and smelling so that you can experience reality more fresh and not be on these later links of dependent origination that cause us a lot of trouble and a lot of turmoil in our minds. So if you can see, the forest or the view right in front of you without being caught in your thoughts about this and that aren't related to the direct perception, the direct photons coming in your eye, it's a much more blissful state of being because you're fully present and you're not going down these later links of dependent origination that create so much of our mental stress. So, practically speaking, going back to the house of cards analogy, you have levels of the card house stacking up. But what this tells us is if we pull out a card from the very bottom layer, the whole thing will collapse. And in dependent origination, that bottom layer card that most of us can access in daily life is called craving, or it's this wanting mind that attaches to the pleasant or unpleasant feeling. So you can actually trace back these giant thought stories in your mind, often start with a simple pleasant or unpleasant feeling. And there's a mind that says, I like it or I don't like it. And if you can kind of locate that in your experience, locate that contraction and tension, then you can release it and you can open the mind and let go of that whole story, that whole chain in the mind is kind of released. That's what we're doing with the 4 R's by recognizing when the mind is lost in a story and then releasing those thoughts and physically relaxing the tension often found in the head. You're letting go of those later links of dependent origination. And then by relishing, you're coming back to the present where you're just staying with the bare experience and you're bringing in a positive emotion that allows your mind to stay present there and to remain, which is the 4th R. So just by noticing how the mind continually constructs our realities in this way, we can start to release more often and let go of the things that we don't want to be thinking about. And metta awareness is kind of the muscle that allows us to do that. It's this awareness of the mind and of the processes that are taking place in your mind-body system, and this kind of stepping back out of it and just noticing what's happening without getting involved. That's where it all starts. That's the fuel for the 4 R's to recognize, release, relish, and then remain as long as you can, being present. This is a very brief summary of dependent origination. There are many ways to talk about it on multiple time scales, but this is kind of an everyday application of it, and we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow about dependent origination. Your daily challenge is to recognize dependent origination in your direct experience at least once today. You could notice, oh yeah, how did I get thinking about this? Oh yeah, it started with that, and before that there was this. And then, oh yeah, it started with a sight, just some shapes and colors hit my eye, or a sound, some sound waves, and then got me thinking about this and that. So thanks so much for hearing me out in this lesson, and I'll see you tomorrow.